The void between stars was not silent on the bridge of the Stalwart, but the sounds were manufactured, a carefully curated auditory environment designed to prevent sensory deprivation in the featureless black. A low, resonant hum emanated from the power core, a sound so deep it was felt in the bones more than heard by the ears, while status reports chimed with a soft, crystalline clarity at various workstations. For senior tactical analyst Kalen, these sounds were the backdrop of a life lived in the deep dark, a familiar symphony that had accompanied him for the better part of a decade. He stood at his post, his tall frame held with the rigid posture drilled into him by years of service, his eyes scanning the three-dimensional tactical plot that hovered in the air before him. It showed nothing but the expected cartographic data, the distant, steady pulse of beacon signals, and the long, lazy arc of their course through this uncharted and supposedly empty sector. His fingers danced across the interface, running another diagnostic on the long-range sensor suite, a habit born of paranoia that had saved lives more than once. Everything was nominal. It was also profoundly, unremarkably nominal. This sector was a blank spot on the galactic maps, a wedge of space avoided by the major polities due to its lack of habitable worlds or discernible resources. It was, by all accounts, a place to pass through, not a destination. The mission of the Stalwart was one of simple, quiet verification, to confirm the nothingness, to plant a figurative flag in the cosmic dirt and move on. Kalen found a certain peace in such missions, a reprieve from the political tensions and brushfire conflicts that flared up along the contested borders of the human stellar nation. Here, there was no one to fight, no complex diplomatic dances to perform, only the vast and indifferent universe. He allowed himself a moment to look away from the plot, his gaze drifting to the main viewport, which showed a starfield so dense it looked like a spill of powdered diamond across black velvet. There was no moon to reflect light, no gas giant to paint the void with bands of color, just the pure, unadulterated deep. It was beautiful in a stark and lonely way. The first anomaly was so subtle it was almost dismissed as a sensor ghost, a flicker of gravitational distortion, there and gone, at the very edge of their detection range. Kalen's head tilted a fraction of a degree, his focus instantly narrowing. His hands moved again, calling up the raw data stream, overlaying it with the gravitational map of the sector. Nothing should be there. Nothing was there, according to every chart and database available to humanity. "Sensor station," he said, his voice calm but carrying easily across the quiet bridge. "Run a level 4 diagnostic on the gravimetric array. I'm reading a transient echo at bearing 027, Mark 011, extreme range." The sensor operator, a young woman with close-cropped hair, nodded briskly. "Running diagnostic now, senior analyst. Scans indicate no hardware faults. It could be a quantum fluctuation or a micro-singularity decay." Kalen's eyes remained fixed on the spot in the plot where the flicker had occurred. Micro-singularities did not just decay in a vacuum. They left traces, radiation signatures that were absent here. This was something else. 15 standard minutes passed without a repeat of the phenomenon. The bridge crew had settled back into their routines, the momentary blip already fading from their minds. Kalen did not forget. He partitioned a section of his console to continuously monitor that vector, setting alerts for any activity, no matter how insignificant. It was this vigilance that meant he was the first to see the second, far more terrifying anomaly. It began not as a flicker, but as a swell. A wave of gravitational distortion so powerful it made the Stalwart's superstructure groan in protest, a deep, metallic sound that was utterly alien amidst the ship's familiar noises. Lights on the bridge flickered, and the tactical plot dissolved into a storm of conflicting data before the stabilizers could compensate. "Report," the voice of Shipmaster Vorian cut through the sudden chaos, sharp and authoritative. "Massive gravitational surge, bearing 027, Mark 011, Kalen responded, his own voice tight. Source is transitioning into real space. The scale. Shipmaster, the scale is unprecedented. On the main viewport, the starfield itself seemed to warp, the pinpricks of light stretching into impossibly long lines before snapping back into place. Where there had been nothing, a shape began to form. It was not a ship that emerged. It was a mountain range, a continent of forged metal and crystalline structures that blotted out the stars. It was easily 20 times the mass of the Stalwart, a leviathan of terrifyingly alien design. Its hull was a patchwork of jagged, asymmetrical plates, deep gray and rust brown, scarred by impacts and energies beyond human comprehension. Strange, non-Euclidean geometries twisted the eye, making it difficult to focus on any single part of the behemoth. It moved with a silent, inexorable momentum that defied its colossal size, and it was on an intercept course. A cold dread, colder than the void outside the hull, settled in Kalen's stomach. This was not a first contact scenario. This was a predator stumbling upon its prey. "Hail them," Vorian commanded, his face a mask of controlled tension. "All frequencies, standard peace and identification protocols." The communications officer worked frantically, but the only response was a surge of incomprehensible data, a shrieking, atonal burst of noise that overloaded the speakers and resolved into no known language or pattern. A moment later, a new icon flashed to life on Kalen's tactical plot, an active weapons lock, using targeting systems whose principles were a complete mystery. "They have a lock," Kalen said, the words tasting like ash. "Energy spike from their forward section. It's a weapon discharge." Vorian's order to enact evasive maneuvers was cut short. A lance of emerald energy, thick as a sequoia tree, erupted from the alien vessel. It did not travel like a plasma bolt or a laser. It seemed to tear through space, leaving a temporary scar of distorted reality in its wake. It struck the Stalwart's forward shield array. The shields, designed to dissipate gigatons of kinetic energy and deflect high-energy particle beams, did not simply fail. They shattered. The feedback surged through the ship's systems, blowing out conduits and overloading power relays. Half the bridge stations went dark, and emergency lighting bathed the compartment in a bloody crimson glow. "Shields are gone, hull breach on decks 4 through 7, primary power offline." The damage control reports were a litany of disaster. The Stalwart was maimed, a single blow from this monstrosity having crippled a vessel that was considered one of humanity's finest. "Return fire, all batteries," Vorian shouted, gripping the railing of his command pulpit to steady himself. The Stalwart's point defense lasers and primary mass driver cannons spoke, spitting coherent light and hypersonic projectiles at the alien colossus. They were like gnats attacking a titan. The lasers scattered harmlessly against a shimmering, dispersive barrier that surrounded the alien ship, and the kinetic rounds detonated against it in brief, futile flowers of light and shrapnel. They had not even scratched the paint. Kalen watched, his mind racing, his analyst's brain discarding fear and focusing on the data. Their weapons were useless. Their defenses were non-existent. Their speed was a joke compared to the aliens' effortless pursuit. They were going to die here, in the dark, for no reason they could comprehend. The alien ship did not fire again immediately. It closed the distance with a lazy, predatory grace, its sheer bulk now filling the entire viewport, a wall of malevolent technology. Smaller craft, like metallic parasites, began to detach from its hull, swarming towards the wounded Stalwart. "Boarders," Vorian whispered, the word carrying a finality that silenced the bridge. He straightened his uniform tunic. "All hands, this is the shipmaster. Prepare to repel boarders. We will sell our lives dearly, for humanity and for the Stalwart." The order was unnecessary. The sounds of combat, the shriek of tearing metal, and the staccato burst of small arms fire were already echoing from the corridors leading to the bridge. Kalen drew his sidearm, a heavy pulse pistol, its weight a small comfort in his hand. He took a position beside the main entrance, his back to the cold titanium wall, his breath coming in slow, controlled cycles. The reinforced blast door glowed orange along its seams, then melted inward with a terrifying silence, vaporized by an energy weapon of unimaginable power. Through the smoke and molten metal, the boarders stepped onto the bridge. They were tall, impossibly slender, their limbs jointed in ways that seemed wrong. They were encased in armor of the same rust-brown and grey as their ship, organic and jagged in its lines. They had no visible faces, only a smooth, curved plate where a head should be, etched with faint, pulsating patterns of sickly green light. They moved with a fluid, insectile speed that was deeply unsettling. Their weapons, extensions of their arms, hummed with a low, hungry energy. The bridge security detail opened fire, pulses of blue light streaking across the compartment. The aliens dodged with preternatural reflexes or simply absorbed hits that should have felled them, their armor dissipating the energy with visible flares. Their return fire was mercilessly efficient. Bolts of the same emerald energy lanced out, and where they struck, they did not just kill, they disassembled. A crewman hit in the chest simply came apart in a cloud of atomized particles, his scream cut short. Kalen aimed and fired, his shot striking one of the creatures in its smooth head plate. The thing staggered, a crack appearing in the armor, a flicker of light from within, but it did not fall. It turned its blank gaze towards him, and he felt a wave of cold, focused malice that was not his own, a psychic pressure that threatened to shatter his mind. He fired again and again, until the creature finally collapsed into a heap of twitching limbs and sputtering energy. It was the last thing he saw before a searing pain erupted in his side, and the world dissolved into a vortex of darkness and agony. His final thought was not of home or family, but of the data. The single, crucial piece of information that had to survive. The recording of the engagement, the sensor logs of the alien vessel. It had to get out. Someone had to know. Consciousness returned to Kalen as a tide of pain, a dull, throbbing ache that radiated from his left side and permeated his entire body. He was lying on a cold, unyielding surface that felt like polished stone, and the air was thick, humid, and carried a metallic tang that coated his tongue. He tried to move, and a fresh wave of agony made him gasp, his muscles locking up. He was alive. The fact was a surprise. He forced his eyes open, his vision blurry at first, then slowly resolving. He was in a cell, but it was unlike any detention facility he had ever seen or imagined. The walls were not metal, but a dark, veined material that seemed either grown or excreted, curving seamlessly into the floor and ceiling. A faint, sourceless greenish light emanated from the walls themselves, casting long, distorted shadows. There were no bars, no visible door, just a smooth, continuous surface. The only feature was a shallow channel cut into the floor that led to a small drain, a grim detail that spoke volumes about the intentions of his captors. He was still in his flight suit, though it was torn and stained with his own dried blood. A rough, synthetic bandage had been applied to the wound on his side, a crude and painful patch job that had staunched the bleeding but little else. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, leaning against the wall, his breath hissing through his teeth. The memory of the battle flooded back, the impossible ship, the shattered shields, the boarders on the bridge. The stalwart was gone, his crewmates were dead, he was a prisoner. The analytical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through countless simulations and real engagements, kicked in, pushing the grief and terror into a locked compartment. He was a senior tactical analyst. His duty was to observe, to analyze, to find weaknesses. Even here, even now, he took a slow, painful inventory of his surroundings. The cell was approximately 3 meters by 3 meters. The air circulation was minimal, the humidity high. He could hear a constant, low-frequency thrum, a vibration that came up through the floor, the same deep hum he had felt on the stalwart, but magnified 100-fold. He was still on the alien ship, or perhaps inside the Leviathan itself. He tested the walls. They were warm to the touch and had a slight give, like hardened rubber, but were utterly unyielding to his strength. An indeterminate amount of time passed, marked only by the rhythm of his own pain and the ship's endless drone. Then, without a sound, a section of the wall simply irised open, revealing not a doorway, but an opening that looked like the petals of a fleshy flower. Two of the aliens stood there, their forms even more intimidating in the confined space. They were taller than he remembered, their slender frames belying a palpable sense of physical power. Their blank, glowing faceplates were fixed on him. One of them raised a limb, not to point a weapon, but to gesture for him to come. The meaning was clear. Kalen considered resistance for a fleeting second, but it was a futile thought. He was wounded, unarmed, and utterly at their mercy. He struggled to his feet, using the wall for support, and limped out of the cell. The corridor outside was more of the same organic-looking architecture, twisting and curving in ways that defied standard engineering principles. There were no right angles, no straight lines. The light was the same sickly green, and the air was even thicker, making it difficult to breathe. The aliens flanked him, their movements silent and perfectly synchronized, herding him down the passageway. They arrived at a larger chamber, circular and domed. In the center was a structure that could only be described as a throne, fashioned from the same dark, veined material and woven with pulsating filaments of light. Seated upon it was another of the aliens, but this one was different. Its armor was more ornate, etched with complex, swirling patterns that glowed with a more intense, almost violent light. Its limbs were longer, more spindly, and it sat with an air of absolute, unassailable authority. This was the one in command. Flanking the throne were several other aliens, some in armor, others in simpler, draped garments that looked disturbingly like shed skin. One of these, a smaller, more fragile-looking creature, stepped forward. It held a complex device of crystalline rods and wires. It approached Kalen and, without ceremony, pressed the device against the side of his head. A sharp, invasive pain lanced through his skull, and for a moment, his vision went white. Then a voice echoed in his mind, flat, toneless, and devoid of any emotion, like a machine trying to simulate speech. "You are of the ephemeral kind, the soft-skinned, short-lived ones." The voice was not heard with his ears, it was implanted directly into his consciousness. Kalen flinched, the violation of the mental contact as painful as the physical wound in his side. He looked at the creature on the throne. "I am a human, an officer of the human stellar nation." The words felt clumsy and inadequate. The mental voice returned, a prompt for data, not a conversation. "Your designation, your vessel's purpose in this sector." "My name is Kalen. Our vessel was on a mapping mission. We meant no intrusion." A wave of cold, contemptuous amusement flowed from the throne, a psychic emanation so strong it made Kalen nauseous. "Mapping? You chart the grave dust. You are vermin, scuttling through the ruins of empires that were ancient when your species was primordial slime. You have nothing. You are nothing." The entity on the throne shifted, and Kalen sensed its focus intensify. "You will provide the spatial coordinates of your nesting worlds, your defensive capabilities, the locations of your resource extraction sites." So that was it. This was not just destruction, it was conquest or consumption. "I will not," Kalen said, his voice stronger than he felt. The response was instantaneous and brutal. One of the armored guards stepped forward and drove the butt of its weapon into Kalen's wounded side. He cried out, collapsing to his knees, the world swimming in a red haze of agony. The mental voice was implacable. "You are a data source. You will be processed. All ephemerals break. It is your nature. You lack the fortitude, the permanence of the Vorla." The name, if it was a name, echoed in his mind with a sense of ancient, cosmic dread. The Vorla, these were the Vorla. The entity on the throne made a dismissive gesture. Begin the deep extraction, strip the layers of his mind, find what is useful, discard the rest. The smaller alien with the device approached again. This time the pain was not a single lance, but a slow, inexorable pressure inside his head, a feeling of fingers prying at the seams of his memories, his thoughts, his very self. He saw flashes of his childhood, of the academy, of the faces of his crewmates as they died. He fought back, throwing up mental barriers, focusing on complex tactical equations, on the schematics of the stalwart, on anything to keep the invaders out. It was a hopeless fight. He was a fortress of sand against a tidal wave. The pressure increased, and he felt something give, a memory of a star chart flickering at the edge of his consciousness, ready to be torn free. It was in that moment of ultimate violation that the universe, or perhaps just fate, intervened. The entire ship shuddered, a violent, grinding convulsion that was far more severe than the normal background hum. The green lights flickered and died for a full 3 seconds, plunging the chamber into absolute blackness before stuttering back to life. The mental pressure in Kalen's head vanished as the alien with the device staggered, its connection broken. Alarms began to sound, not as audible sirens, but as a shrill, psychic shriek that echoed inside the skull of every sentient being aboard. The entity on the throne rose to its full, terrifying height, its psychic presence radiating fury and urgency. Containment breach in the primary drive nexus. All sentinels to the core. The unbound stirs. The guards who had been flanking Kalen immediately turned and sprinted from the chamber, their insectile speed more pronounced in their panic. The translator aliens scurried after them, and the commanding entity swept out in a whirl of ornate armor and palpable rage. Kalen was left alone, kneeling on the floor, his mind bruised and bleeding but intact. The deep extraction had been halted. He didn't know what a primary drive nexus was or what the unbound could be, but the Vorla's fear was a tangible force in the air. This was a distraction, a catastrophic systems failure, and it was his only chance. He pushed himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He was alone in the command chamber of an alien warship. He had to move. He stumbled out of the chamber and back into the twisting corridor. The psychic alarm was still blaring, a constant, painful static in his mind, and he could feel running vibrations through the deck plates, the ship groaning like a living beast in agony. He had no plan, no destination. His only goal was to avoid recapture, and if the universe was feeling generous, to find a way off this hellish vessel. He turned a corner and found himself facing a scene of chaos. A section of the corridor wall had ruptured, spewing forth a viscous, glowing green fluid. 2 Vorla lay on the floor, their bodies twisted and broken, not from weapons fire, but from some immense internal force. Their armor was cracked open, and from within spilled not blood, but a tangle of wiry filaments and crystalline structures. They were as much machine as they were organic. He stepped over them, his mind reeling. He moved on, driven by instinct, putting distance between himself and the throne room. He found a recess in the wall, a niche that seemed to house a cluster of pulsating, organic-looking conduits, and he squeezed into it, trying to make himself small, to become just another piece of the ship's bizarre anatomy. He would wait here in the belly of the beast, and he would watch, and he would learn. Time lost all meaning within the pulsating, groaning depths of the Vorla ship. Kalen existed in a state of heightened, feral awareness, his every sense tuned to the alien environment around him. He moved like a ghost through the organic corridors, using the periodic convulsions of the ship and the continuing psychic distress signals as cover. He learned to read the patterns in the wall light. A steady, slow pulse meant a quiet section, while a frantic, strobing flicker always preceded a surge of activity, either repair crews of smaller, drone-like Vorla or squads of the armed sentinels rushing to some new crisis point. He learned to avoid the larger, trunk-like conduits that occasionally vented superheated steam or sprays of corrosive fluid. He was a student of this terrifying new world, and his sole textbook was survival. He subsisted on a disgusting, gelatinous substance he found leaking from a ruptured pipe in an abandoned chamber. It tasted of metal and decay, but it was caloric, and it kept him alive. Water he siphoned from condensation on colder sections of the walls. He was slowly starving, dehydrating, and his wound was becoming infected, a hot, painful throb with every heartbeat, but he was free, and he was learning. The nature of the crisis became clearer over time, pieced together from the fragmented psychic impressions that washed over him and the physical evidence he witnessed. The Valar referred to it as the Unbound. It was not an external threat, but an internal one. Something that powered their ship, something they had contained, was breaking free. He witnessed a team of sentinels attempting to reinforce a massive, circular bulkhead that was glowing cherry red around its edges. The metal was buckling inward, and from the seams leaked not heat, but a chilling, absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the very light from the corridor. The Valar were welding crystalline rods into place, their movements frantic. Then, with a sound that was less a noise and more a rupture in reality, the bulkhead exploded inward. The blackness did not flood out, it unfolded. It was a wave of nothingness, and where it touched the Valar sentinels, they did not scream. They simply ceased. Their forms dissolved into static and were erased from existence. The wave receded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a perfectly smooth, hemispherical crater in the deck and bulkheads, as if a giant sphere had simply been scooped out of the ship's substance. The Valar on the other side of the corridor, those who had been shielded from the direct effect, stood frozen for a moment in pure, undiluted terror before scrambling away. Kaelin, hidden in his niche, felt a cold sweat break out over his entire body. This Unbound was a force of annihilation, a reality devourer. The Valar, for all their power, were terrified of it. This observation sparked the first ember of a plan in Kaelin's mind. It was an insane, suicidal plan, but it was the only one he had. The Valar were his captors, his torturers, the destroyers of his ship and crew. They were also the only thing containing this Unbound. If he could help the Unbound break free, it would destroy the Valar ship. It would kill him too, but his death was already a certainty. This way, his death would mean something. It would be a weapon. He began to move with purpose, no longer just hiding, but hunting. He needed to find the heart of the containment system, the core of the Valar's control over this terrifying entity. His knowledge of starship design was human, but the principles of power distribution and central control had to have universal parallels. The largest conduits, the most intense energy signatures, the heaviest guard presence, these would lead him to the core. He followed the thickest of the pulsing conduits, the ones that throbbed with a rhythmic, powerful energy that made his teeth ache. The psychic alarm was a constant now, a headache-inducing whine that spoke of a losing battle. After what felt like an eternity of creeping through the ship's visceral interior, he found it. It was not a room, but a chasm. A vast, cylindrical void that ran through the center of the ship for kilometers. He was on a gantry that overlooked this impossible space, and the sight stole the breath from his lungs. The walls of the chasm were lined with tier upon tier of crystalline structures, all focused inward, projecting interlocking fields of shimmering, multi-hued energy towards the center. And in the center, contained by these fields, was the Unbound. It was not a creature, not a machine. It was a whole, a perfect spherical void in reality, perhaps 100 meters in diameter. It was blacker than black, an absence so complete that looking at it felt like having a piece of your soul carved out. Around its edges, space-time itself writhed and fractured, and occasional tendrils of the same annihilating darkness would lash out, striking the containment fields. Each impact sent violent ripples through the energy matrices, and the crystalline projectors would flare blindingly bright, struggling to hold the line. The air crackled with ozone and raw power, and the psychic pressure here was immense, a constant, silent scream of rage from the entity within the void. This was the Valar's engine, their power source. They had harnessed a singularity, or something far worse, and they were losing their grip on it. Scattered around the circumference of the chasm were control nodes, platforms where Valar technicians monitored the containment fields, making constant, minute adjustments. Their focus was absolute, their terror a palpable force. This was where he had to act. He needed to disrupt one of those nodes, to create a cascade failure in the containment field. He looked around, assessing his options. He was unarmed. The gantry he was on led to several other platforms, but they were all occupied. Then his eyes fell on a cluster of the organic-looking conduits that ran along the gantry wall. One of them, a thick, pulsating tube, was venting a faint mist of the same green fluid he had seen before. It was damaged, perhaps from the recent tremors. An idea, born of desperation and a fundamental understanding of cause and effect, formed in his mind. He moved to the conduit, ignoring the pain in his side. He examined the rupture. It was a crack, about a hand's width long. He needed to widen it. He looked around for a tool, anything. There was nothing. Then he remembered the crude bandage on his side. It was made of a rough, synthetic material. He peeled it off, the action-fresh agony as it pulled at his clotted wound. He wadded the material up, and using a piece of shrapnel from a damaged section of the gantry, he jammed the wad deep into the crack in the conduit. It was a primitive fuse. He needed a spark. He retreated back down the gantry, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the conduit. He needed to draw fire. He stepped out into the open, on a section of the gantry that was clearly visible from the nearest control node. He waved his arms, shouting, a raw, wordless cry of defiance. It worked instantly. Two of the Vaula sentinels guarding the node turned, their blank faceplates locking onto him. They raised their weapons. He didn't wait. He turned and ran back towards the conduit, putting all his remaining strength into a limping, desperate sprint. Emerald energy bolts sizzled past him, vaporizing sections of the gantry railing. One bolt grazed his leg, and he cried out, stumbling but staying upright. He reached the conduit, diving past it just as the two sentinels rounded the corner. They saw him, and they fired. The bolts missed him, but they struck the conduit directly where he had planted the wadded bandage. There was a brilliant flash of green-white light, and then a thunderous explosion as the pressurized conduit violently ruptured. A torrent of superheated, corrosive fluid erupted, engulfing the two sentinels. They didn't even have time to scream as their armor and bodies were dissolved into slurry. The explosion didn't stop there. It severed the conduit entirely and blew a gaping hole in the gantry wall, and the cascading energy surge traveled along the conduit's path, straight towards the control node. Alarms, both audible and psychic, reached a deafening crescendo. The Vaula technicians at the node looked up in horror as their consoles exploded in showers of sparks and molten crystal. The intricate patterns of the containment field flickered, an entire section of the multi-hued energy matrix stuttering and failing. It was only a small section, a few degrees of arc around the massive sphere of nothingness, but it was enough. The Unbound, sensing weakness, reacted with instant, violent hunger. A vast tendril of absolute blackness, larger than any he had seen before, lashed out from the void. It touched the now unshielded section of the chasm wall. A perfect hemisphere, a kilometer across, simply vanished from the ship. Decks, supports, conduits, Vaula, everything in that volume was erased without a trace. The ship gave a titanic lurch, the groaning of its structure becoming a continuous, dying shriek. The artificial gravity failed, and Kalen was thrown into the air, tumbling in the zero-G chaos. He grabbed onto a piece of twisted gantry, holding on for his life. He looked towards the center of the chasm. The containment field was destabilizing completely, flickering like a failing light bulb. The Unbound was expanding, its perfect black sphere slowly, inexorably beginning to grow. He had done it. He had signed the death warrant for the Vaula Leviathan and for himself. As he floated in the disintegrating heart of the ship, watching the end of the world approach, he felt not fear, but a grim, profound satisfaction. He had turned their own power against them. He had not been broken. He had fought back. The expansion of the Unbound was not an explosion, it was an unraveling. The perfect black sphere at the ship's core simply enlarged, and whatever it touched ceased to be. There was no sound of tearing metal, no flash of light, only a silent, inexorable cancellation of existence. Kalen clung to his handhold on the bucking gantry. watching as entire sections of the immense chasm wall were silently scooped away into nothingness. The Vorla were in a frenzy, a swarm of insects whose hive was being systematically disassembled. He saw their smaller craft, the ones that had swarmed the stalwart, attempting to flee, launching from bays only to be caught in the edge of the expanding void and wiped from reality. There was no escape for them. The ship systems were in total collapse. The pulsating green light was replaced by the strobing crimson of catastrophic failure, and the psychic alarm had become a continuous, mind-shearing shriek of collective agony and terror from the thousands of Vorla aboard. He had beaten them. He had proven that the ephemerals, for all their short lives and soft flesh, could wield a final, decisive vengeance. It was in this maelstrom of destruction that a new sensation brushed against his mind. It was not the cold, invasive probe of the Vorla, nor was it their psychic screams. This was different. It was a question, a single, complex concept imprinted directly into his consciousness. It carried a sense of immense age, of profound loneliness, and now of burgeoning curiosity. Origin, the thought was clear, unambiguous. Kalen started, his head whipping around as if he could see the source. There was nothing but the collapsing ship and the growing void. Point of origin, the thought came again, more insistent. It was the unbound. It was not a mindless force of nature, it was sentient, and it was talking to him. The realization was more terrifying than the destruction itself. He had not freed a weapon, he had unleashed a god, and it had noticed him. "What are you?" he thought, the words forming in his mind, a desperate mental shout into the storm. The response was not in words, but in a flood of images, of sensations. He saw the birth of stars, the swirling of nebulae, the slow, patient dance of galaxies. He felt the cold of the deep void, the ageless patience of a consciousness that had witnessed cosmic cycles come and go. He saw the Vorla not as mighty conquerors, but as parasites, as grubs that had dared to build their nest around it, to siphon its boundless energy, to bind it with their pitiful, crystalline chains. It had slept, or perhaps simply tolerated them, for millennia. His actions had not so much freed it as they had annoyed it into wakefulness, and now it was curious. The entity, for he could no longer think of it as a mere it, sought context. It had been bound by the Vorla, and now a being of a completely different order, a fragile, fleeting thing of carbon and water, had been the catalyst for its release. This was an anomaly. This was new. "You are not of the binders, you are other. Define your existence." Kalen's mind raced. How did one define humanity to a starborn entity? He thought of Earth not as a dot on a chart, but as a world of blue oceans and green lands. He thought of the warmth of a sun on his skin, the feeling of wind, the memory of a human face, the love for his crew, the rage against the Vorla. He poured it all out, a raw, unfiltered stream of human experience. The joy, the sorrow, the creativity, the stubborn, defiant will to survive. He showed it the stalwart, its destruction, his capture, his torture, his decision to fight back even at the cost of his own life. He showed it that his actions were not just a desire for destruction, but an act of defiance, a statement that even an ephemeral could choose the manner of its ending. The entity was silent for a long moment, a silence that stretched as the void continued its slow, inexorable consumption of the Vorla ship. The sense of ancient, patient curiosity deepened. A fleeting light, yet it burns brightly. You possess a resonance the binders lack. They only take. You create. Even in your end, you create meaning. A new concept formed in Kalen's mind, one of proposal, of transaction. This construct is a cage. You have broken the locks. I am grateful. A debt is owed to the fleeting light. Before Kalen could form a response, he felt a change in the entity's presence. The expanding sphere of nothingness paused its growth. Then it began to change. The perfect, featureless blackness at its center began to swirl, to coalesce. It was no longer simply erasing matter. It was manipulating it, reordering it on a fundamental level. A tendril of the void, now shot through with faint, impossible colors, reached out towards him. It did not annihilate him. Instead, it wrapped around him, a cocoon of cool, non-existent space. He felt a sensation of immense motion, not through space, but through the substrate of reality itself. The dying shrieks of the Vola ship faded away, replaced by a profound and absolute silence. He was no longer in the ship. He was inside the entity, or perhaps he was the entity for a fleeting, terrifying instant. He saw the universe not as a collection of stars and planets, but as a vast, intricate tapestry of forces and dimensions, and he understood that the Unbound was a weaver of this tapestry, a fundamental part of the cosmic order that the Vola had been foolish enough to try and harness. The journey ended as suddenly as it began. The cocoon of void dissolved, and Kalen found himself lying on a cool, smooth surface. The air was clean and dry, and a gentle yellow-white light shone from above. He pushed himself up, his body aching, but the searing pain in his side was gone. He looked down. The wound was healed, leaving only a pale, smooth scar. He was in a small, spherical room with featureless white walls. In the center of the room floated a single, perfect sphere of darkness, a miniature version of the Unbound, about the size of his fist. The voice echoed in his mind once more, but it was softer now, almost gentle. The debt is paid. Your physical form is stabilized. The binder's vessel is processed. Their threat to your kind in this locality is neutralized. Kalen stared at the floating sphere. Where am I, a construct? A temporary eddy in the flow of reality, shaped for your comfort. I have placed you near a point of relevance. A section of the white wall shimmered and became transparent, a viewport looking out into space. The sight outside made his heart stop. He was looking at a star system, a yellow star, familiar in its spectral class. And hanging in the blackness, gleaming in the sunlight, was a space station. It was a massive, rotating torus design, studded with docking ports and communication arrays. And on its side, in bold, familiar script, were the identifying markings of the human stellar nation. It was Sentinel Station, a major hub on the frontier. He was home, or at least he was at its doorstep. The data you valued, the entity's thought continued, the record of your engagement. It is embedded in the communication systems of this construct. It will be broadcast upon your command. Your people will know of the binders. They will be warned. Kalen looked from the viewport to the floating sphere of void. This entity, this Unbound, had not just saved his life. It had delivered him to safety and had given him the one thing he had fought for, the chance to warn humanity. The scale of its power was incomprehensible. It had traversed light years in an instant, healed his mortal wounds, and created this pocket of reality just for him. "Thank you," he said, the words utterly inadequate. The sphere pulsed with a soft, dark light. "The fleeting light is worthy of preservation. Your resonance is a unique pattern in the great design. I will watch your kind, Kalen of humanity. There is interest." The sphere then began to shrink, collapsing in on itself until, with a final, silent flicker, it was gone. The psychic presence vanished, leaving Kalen alone in the quiet room. He was adrift in a lifeboat of impossible origin, carrying a warning that would change everything. He was the sole survivor of the Stalwart, the man who had faced the Vola and the Unbound and lived to tell the tale. He walked to the console that had materialized near the viewport. A single, large button glowed with a soft, blue light. The broadcast command. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first clean air he had breathed in what felt like a lifetime, and pressed it. The signal burst from the impossible, featureless pod that had appeared without warning just 10 kilometers from Sentinel Station's main defensive perimeter. It was a raw, unencrypted data dump on all standard and emergency frequencies, a digital scream that overloaded routine traffic and sent priority alerts flashing across every command console in the system. It contained the complete sensor logs from the TSS Stalwart, from the first gravimetric flicker to the final, catastrophic border alert. It contained visual records of the Vola Leviathan, of its terrifyingly efficient weaponry, and of the butchery on the bridge. And finally, it contained a personal log from senior tactical analyst Kalen, a stark, unemotional account of his capture, his imprisonment, his torture, and his desperate suicidal gambit that led to the destruction of the alien ship. The message ended with a single, repeated warning: the Vorla are a predatory, expansionist species. They view other life as ephemeral, as resources to be consumed or data to be extracted. They possess technology far surpassing our own. They are coming, prepare. On Sentinel Station, the message caused bedlam. The station commander, a veteran of border skirmishes named Commander Valerius, initially dismissed it as an elaborate, sick hoax. But the data was too detailed, too internally consistent, and the energy signatures recorded from the Vorla weapons and drive systems were unlike anything in human science. And then there was the pod itself. Scans revealed it was a perfect sphere of an unknown, non-atomic material. It emitted no energy, had no propulsion system, no life support, and yet it contained a single human life sign: Kalen. When a recovery team finally managed to cut their way through the seemingly impenetrable hull, they found him standing calmly in the empty, white room, waiting for them. He was gaunt, pale, and his eyes held a depth of trauma that made seasoned Marines look away, but he was lucid, coherent, and unwavering in his story. He was debriefed for days, weeks, his every word analyzed, his biometrics scrutinized for signs of coercion or false memory implantation. He held firm. The story was true. The human stellar nation, a sprawling and often fractious coalition of colonies and systems, was thrown into unprecedented unity by the threat. The political squabbles and economic disputes that had dominated the news cycles vanished overnight, replaced by a single, galvanizing purpose: survival. The Vorla, as named by Kalen, represented an existential threat. They were not rivals to be negotiated with. They were locusts, a force of nature that consumed everything in its path. The military, once a dispersed force for peacekeeping and policing, was put on a total war footing. The Senate on Earth, in an emergency session, passed the unflinching Sky Act, authorizing the immediate and total mobilization of all industrial and scientific resources towards planetary and system defense. Shipyards around Sol and the core colonies, which had once built elegant exploration vessels and bulky freighters, now worked around the clock, their orbital docks glowing like new suns as they forged warships. The designs were brutal, pragmatic, stripped of all non-essentials. They were built around massive spinal-mounted railguns and banks of missile launchers, their doctrine shaped by the one crucial piece of intelligence Kalen had provided. Vorla shields were highly effective against energy weapons, but had shown a minor, fleeting vulnerability to concentrated kinetic impact. Kalen himself became the nexus of the entire effort. He was not a politician or a flag officer, but his first-hand experience made him the closest thing humanity had to an expert on the enemy. He was promoted to a newly created position, Director of Xeno-Threat Analysis. His office was a cavernous situation room deep within Sentinel Station, its walls covered in constantly updating displays showing fleet deployments, resource allocations, and the latest tactical simulations based on the stalwart data. He worked 20-hour days, his existence reduced to data streams and strategy meetings. He helped design new combat drills, emphasizing swarm tactics and coordinated strikes on single points, hoping to overwhelm the Vorla defenses through sheer volume of fire. He insisted on the widespread implementation of scuttle charges on all new warships, power core overloads designed to deny the enemy any technological salvage. He was the architect of humanity's desperate defense, a man building a wall against a tsunami. The psychological toll was immense. He rarely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with the silent, blank faceplates of the Vorla and the chilling, featureless blackness of the Unbound. He had become a symbol, the man who had looked into the abyss and returned, but a part of him felt he had left his soul in that dark, organic ship. 3 standard years passed, 3 years of frantic, desperate preparation. The early warning network, a chain of long-range sensor platforms deployed along the vector from which the stalwart had been attacked, was the tripwire for the entire defense. It was this network that finally sent the signal they had all been dreading and, in a strange way, waiting for. A gravitational distortion, identical to the one Kalen had first detected, was registered at the network's outermost edge. Then another, and another, dozens of them. They were coming not as a single ship, but as an armada. The war, which had until now been a theoretical exercise, a ghost haunting their strategies, had become real. On Sentinel Station, the battle station's alarm sounded, a deep, resonant klaxon that vibrated through the very bones of the structure. On the main tactical display in Kalen's situation room, a wave of red icons appeared, moving with terrifying speed into human space. The first line of defense, a picket line of destroyers and automated weapon platforms, engaged. The data feeds were grim. The Vola shields held against everything the picket line could throw at them. The human ships died, one by one, their valiant last stands lasting only seconds against the emerald lances of annihilation. But they died according to doctrine. They died fighting, and they died without giving up a single byte of data, their scuttle charges flaring like tiny supernovae in the dark. The first battle was a total loss, but it was not a waste. It confirmed the enemy's capabilities, and it bought a few precious hours for the main fleet to assemble. Kalen watched the icons of the picket ships wink out on the display, his face a stone mask. This was it. The fleeting light was about to be tested. The core system's fleet, designated the First Allied Fleet, assembled at the rally point near the Cygnus X-1 Nebula, a vast cloud of dust and gas that would provide some sensor cover and interfere with directed energy weapons. It was the largest concentration of human military power in history, hundreds of ships ranging from nimble, missile-armed frigates to hulking, armor-plated battleships, their hulls bristling with mass-driver batteries and point defense lasers. At its heart was the flagship, the Indomitable, a vessel born from the lessons of the Stalwart. It was a grim, angular fortress of a ship, its design a testament to a species that had learned it was not the top of the food chain. Aboard the Indomitable, in the flag briefing room, Fleet Admiral Jaxa, a stern woman with a career built on logistical brilliance, stood before her senior commanders, and beside her stood Kalen. He wore the simple uniform of an analyst, no rank insignia, but his presence commanded more respect than any admiral's braid. The holographic display between them showed the advancing Vola Armada, a swarm of red icons that outnumbered the human fleet 2-1. "They will not deviate from their course," Kalen said, his voice flat, the voice of a man reading from a script he had written in his own blood. "Their strategy is one of overwhelming force. They will attempt to break our formation with their lead elements, these heavier vessels here." He highlighted several larger red icons, while their lighter craft attempt to flank and pick off our support ships. Their command and control appears to be centralized within these 3 leviathans at the rear. They are the key. Destroy them, and the swarm may lose cohesion. Admiral Jaxa nodded, her eyes fixed on the display. "Then that is the priority. The Indomitable and the 1st Battleship Division will spearhead the assault on the command ships. We will be the anvil. The 2nd and 3rd carrier groups will act as the hammer, deploying their fighter wings to screen our flanks and concentrate their anti-ship missiles on the Leviathans once their shields are down. All other units, your orders are to engage, disrupt, and survive. Do not throw your lives away in a futile stand. We must make them pay for every kilometer." The plan was a gamble, a desperate attempt to decapitate the enemy before their superior numbers and technology could grind the human fleet into dust. It relied on the one advantage Kalen insisted they had, the Vorla's utter contempt for ephemerals. They would not be expecting a targeted surgical strike. They would be expecting panic and disarray. The two fleets converged. The space between them was at first a pristine void, then it became a storm. The opening salvo was a wave of missiles from the human carriers, thousands of projectiles streaking across the black, their drives painting temporary lines of light against the stars. The Vawler response was a wall of emerald energy, their point defense systems effortlessly vaporizing the majority of the incoming swarm. But some got through, impacting on the shimmering shields of the lead Vawler vessels, causing them to flare brightly but not fail. Then the main lines collided. Mass driver rounds, accelerated to a fraction of light speed, crossed the distance, slamming into Vawler hulls. The results were the same as before, minimal effect. The human ships, however, began to die. A frigate, the Courage, was bisected by an emerald lance, its two halves spinning away, venting atmosphere and bodies. A destroyer, the Resolute, charged a Vawler cruiser, firing its railguns at point-blank range until its own scuttle charge erased it from existence, taking the cruiser with it in a final, defiant act of mutual destruction. The battle was a slaughterhouse. The human fleet was being methodically dismantled. From the bridge of the Indomitable, Kalen watched the tactical plot, his heart a cold stone in his chest. It was happening again. The same overwhelming power, the same futile resistance. The Indomitable shuddered as a near miss from a Vawler energy weapon vaporized one of its escorting cruisers. Shields at 40%, port battery is offline. Admiral Jaxa stood firm. Stay on course. All power to forward shields and engines. We have to reach the command ships. They were the anvil, and they were being pounded into scrap. The Vawler Leviathans loomed ahead, immense and seemingly invulnerable. The human fighter wings, brave to the point of insanity, swarmed around them, their small-caliber guns and missiles having no more effect than pinpricks. They were dying by the squadron. Despair began to creep into the edges of Kalen's consciousness. They had prepared, they had fought, but it wasn't enough. The differential in technology was too great. It was in this moment of impending defeat that the universe shifted. A new presence announced itself, not on the tactical plot, but in the minds of every human in the fleet. It was a familiar sensation to Kalen, a vast, ancient, and patient consciousness brushing against their own. A sense of immense, spatial folding occurred at the periphery of the battle. Space itself twisted, and from the twist emerged a single perfect sphere of absolute blackness. It was the Unbound. It had come. It did not attack. It simply hung there, a hole in reality, and its presence sent a psychic shockwave through the Vawler armada that was visible on the tactical display. The relentless, coordinated advance of the alien ships faltered. Their formations stuttered. Their fire became erratic. The human fleet, sensing the shift, redoubled its efforts. "What is it doing?" Admiral Jaxa whispered, her voice full of awe and terror. Kalen understood. "It's not fighting for us," he said, his own voice barely a whisper. "It's observing, it's judging." The Unbound was a scientist, and the battlefield was its laboratory. It was testing the resonance it had found in humanity. Then it acted. It did not fire weapons. It simply edited. One of the Vawler Leviathans, the central command ship, simply winked out of existence. There was no explosion, no debris, no release of energy. One moment it was a colossal, terrifying warship. The next, there was only empty space where it had been. A second later, another Leviathan, and then the third, vanished in the same silent, absolute manner. The effect on the Vawler fleet was instantaneous and catastrophic. The remaining ships, bereft of their central command, devolved into chaos. Some turned to flee, others began firing wildly, some even turned on each other in their confusion. The predator had become the prey. The human fleet, sensing the moment of ultimate vulnerability, surged forward. Mass driver rounds now found unshielded hulls, punching through and detonating deep inside the alien vessels. Missiles found their marks, tearing the disorganized Vawler ships apart. The battle was not won, but the tide had turned irrevocably. Kalen watched the unfolding victory, but his eyes were fixed on the sphere of the Unbound. As the last of the Vaula Command ships were hunted down and destroyed, the entity pulsed once, a wave of dark light that conveyed a single, clear concept to him, and him alone: satisfaction. The pattern is affirmed. The fleeting light burns bright. The debt is settled. And then, as silently as it had arrived, the Unbound folded back out of reality, leaving behind a scarred and reeling human fleet amidst the drifting wreckage of its enemy. The Battle of Cygnus X1 was over. Humanity had won. They had won through their own courage, their sacrifice, and their stubborn will to fight. But they had also won because a force of nature had found them. Interesting. As the cheers of victory began to echo across the bridge of the Indomitable, Kalen looked out at the stars, knowing that humanity was no longer just one species among many. They were now known to powers beyond their comprehension. They had faced the unflinching sky, and they had not been found wanting. The future was uncertain, fraught with new dangers and new wonders, but for the first time since the destruction of the Stalwart, Kalen felt not dread, but a fragile, burgeoning hope. The galaxy was vast and terrible, but humanity had earned its place within it.